What is up, theology nerds? Today on the podcast, Jesuit theologian and friend of the pod, Ryan Dunns is back, and boy, is he getting provocative. He says that horror is the most conservative film genre, and that's exactly why it works so well for theology. To be scared, you first have to believe there's something worth protecting. Well, he not only has a brand new book looking at horror and theology, but he's got a class on it that he teaches. And in that class, he's had all sorts of diverse responses from parents emailing him to say, hey, why are you doing a theology of murder class? They're going to turn us all into axe murderers. And that very same class, a student ends up entering the Jesuits. Well, if you want to know just what a philosophical theologian is doing teaching a class on horror and theology, then this conversation's for you. The book is even better because it's got so many examples of different films. You don't want to be a spoiler guy. You don't want to go spoiling all the fun of watching, getting scared out of your mind on TV. Plus, I'm kind of a wuss when it comes to horror films, and some of them I had only started. I have very vivid dreams. But, including a dream about talking with Ryan about this book after I read it. So thank you, Ryan, for coming back on the podcast. And I'd love for you, if you dig this, you got a horror film fan in your life who likes to nerd out, send it to him. Recommend the book. It's a great gift for Christmas, birthday, or something like that. And then you can go to the theater, watch a new horror film, and you can nerd out with your geek out, inspired by Dr. Dunns.
Hey Homebrewed listeners, this is producer Josh just jumping in here to let you know there were some technical difficulties on Tripp's side of things with this interview. So I did cut out a lot of his commentary, just like some skipping and some compression issues with his file lagging. We are going to keep most of what Ryan said, but just letting you know it's kind of a condensed version on Tripp's side. Feel free to listen at a faster speed or kind of skip through if it's too annoying for you, but we wanted to preserve what we could of this interview for you. And as always, thanks for listening.
Thank you so much for having me. I've enjoyed our two previous conversations, so I'm really looking forward to this one.
For those that don't remember or hadn't listened to the previous conversation, tell us a bit about the origin story and how the engagement of that kind of film with undergrad students became a helpful way of thinking about the transcendent in a secular age of sorts.
Sure. I'm a Jesuit priest, Roman Catholic priest, a member of the Society of Jesus. And while many people would know Jesuit schools for their basketball teams or Jesuits because we are so deeply associated with education, when St. Ignatius and the First Companions envisioned the society as a really a missionary order, able to go wherever the need was greatest to help others, to help, in Ignatius's words, to help souls. So that missionary zeal and dynamic always appealed to my imagination. And I'm the first to admit, although I passed well my comprehensive exams in my languages in German and French and Latin, language does not come easily to me. And I often felt that I was a deficient Jesuit because of that. And because I was not capable, or I didn't feel myself capable of being the missionary in the model that Ignatius might have envisioned, of being able to go off to far off countries and adapt and proclaim the gospel. But what I have come to realize is that although my language skills with foreign languages may not be good, I did have a knack for, maybe if we put it this way, of being a missionary of the imagination, of finding territory and terrain of the human mind and heart of our culture where I felt comfortable treading and spreading the gospel and working with young adults, high school students, and then certain college students. And noting that horror and comedy were the two most popular film genres for the demographic. It struck me that my own interest in horror, coupled with their appetite for the macabre, seemed to suggest that this could be a very fruitful place to try to work out a method of theological reflection that begins in a pretty unorthodox place, but can arrive nevertheless at very orthodox positions. So that's sort of that's one origin. It comes out of my own sense of deep inadequacy and desire to be a good Jesuit.
Well, I'll just say the fact that I was much more enthralled when you did very distinctively Catholic metaphysics. It was much more persuasive than when I normally read it. As a process philosopher, I don't normally find an argument around the privation of the good as compelling as yours, and which I just mean I must be enjoying it because my natural prejudice towards that argument dissipated for a minute.
Oh, good. All right, I did something. Yes.
Yes. In the book, you define horror, this is a quote, the embodied response of an agent to the advent of a horrifying entity whose unexpected arrival creates a breach in one's known world and threatens that world with annihilation. I wonder if you could just explain how you distinguish horror from terror and how that distinction's crucial for the preceding kind of metaphysical and theological analysis that follows.
Great. So I do draw a distinction between horror and terror, and it's one based in Radcliffe, the 17th century author. Radcliffe understood that terror, she sees terror as atmospheric, as all-encompassing. It's that sense that weighs heavily on your shoulder and makes your skin crawl, but that sense of dis-ease that you do not know from whence it comes because it's all around you. I would say, like, if you take the movie Hereditary is it's I think primarily a terror movie because of the way the music contributes to making you uncomfortable and setting you ill at ease. Horror, by contrast, has something very, if we want to use philosophical language, intentional about it. You are horrified at something. It is the monster whose head emerges from under the bed that scares you. It is the realization that the ravenous zombie horde is outside your door that terrifies you. So horror in this case it's directed towards something. Now, part of the fun of a horror movie can be the atmosphere of terror breeds a sense that there's something horrifying that we have not yet seen, and you wrestle with what that looks like. But I would add this, this often shocks people. I just wouldn't do it, I do, that horror is the most conservative of all film genres. And the idea of something being conservative, we've framed it with such terrible baggage. But in a real sense, in order for horror to work, the author needs to establish a cinematic world, paracosm maybe, that you find relatable and credible and understandable, and that you as a viewer will invest your own psychic and emotional energy in preserving the status quo as depicted. That is the goal of I would say just about every character in a horror movie. They're trying to preserve or return to the status quo. And whatever it is that is horrifying, the monster, I think Robin Wood is known for saying normality is threatened by the monster. That monster, whatever it is, doesn't fit in, doesn't belong, and it is in your best interest, if you want to preserve your life, to resist it. So there's a lot going on in order for you to enjoy a horror movie. There are a lot of presuppositions that the director and the producer and the author have made about you and your imagination that when you start to reflect on it, you realize how deep and engrossing these films can be.
Yeah. So that concept that you talk about, the Robin Wood's formula that normality is threatened by the monster, that you talk about it as metastasis. And then you also talk about frag events and how they function as sites of kind of the horrific shattering, but those events are actually revelatory of kind of the inversion that's taking place in horror. Maybe you can say a bit more about both of those concepts and maybe give a few examples so people will go, oh, okay, yeah, I remember when that happens in this film.
Sure. So let's take the word metastasis, which, who doesn't love a good Greek word? So let's break it up.
You could clearly go to school to learn one of those.
Oh,
it makes you feel better about your student loans when you can bring it up in a conversation.
Like if I were to get another tattoo, I might just have to do like Actually, I would do metaxology for William Desmond. So here, we could go make it very simple. When we talk about a taxis, Taxis, not taxis, like a taxi, I don't think they exist anymore, but a taxis is the order, an order. Let's take a very common example, or one more accessible to popular imagination. The beginning of the movie Jaws, 1975, right? So we have kids on a beach, they're drinking beer, they're sitting around a fire. Two of them peel off from the group to go skinny dipping. Chrissy, I think is her name, she gets out into the water. The boy, as he tries to take his clothes off and is drunk, falls asleep on the beach. The taxis, halcyon, fun, summertime, tranquil waters, beautiful. And what isn't as so much fun as, going for a midnight swim? Great. We have the taxis. And then the famous music. And we don't ever see what it is that is just beneath the surface. But its presence is certainly felt by the young woman who is suddenly plunged into the water, and then she emerges, screams for help, and is shaken about, and then we know that she's killed. That is the meta-taxis. It is the disruption of the stable status quo order as given because of the incursion of the monster. Cinematically, that's what we're always watching, is a taxis that is being disrupted. The counterexample, an easy one, Noel Carroll, who wrote The Philosophy of Horror, I think would use this too. If you've watched Star Wars, I don't know about you, but if a Chewbacca-like Wookiee figure walked into my office right now, I would run, because that doesn't make any sense to me. I mean, a Chewbacca, this hirsute critter, ought not to be in my office. But in the world of Star Wars, Chewbacca blends in with Ewoks and with Jabba the Hutt and other Sarlacc pits and whatnot. Well, they fit within that world. So Chewbacca in the Star Wars universe is part of the taxis. In our world, decidedly not. So that's what we're watching, the cinematic taxis, and then the threat of the meta-taxis that the characters respond to. When we talk about frag events, I use this from the late David Tracy. And for as important as it is, he doesn't spend tons and tons of pages on it. When we think of the word fragment can be a noun and a verb. A fragment, like a little pebble, a bit of a brick that has been knocked off. And that fragment of the brick can fragment something. So you're driving down the highway, and a fragments your windshield. For Tracy, the experience of the frag event is an experience of a breakdown that intimates a more substantial, transcendent presence. For instance, Descartes' meditations, you have the experience of the finite human thinker who's contemplating the infinite. And Descartes pushes on that. He's like, how is it that the finite individual can have this idea of the infinite? And he thinks with Levinas and I think Marion that this could be a characteristic of a frag event, that we think more than we could possibly think. And that there's this eruption. Oh, this is so big. Cinematically, the frag events, when they are engaging us and they have drawn us into their narrative, the frag event gets us to consider, is the world all that we see, all that we can measure and manage and quantify and control? Or are there dimensions of reality, like William James thought that there were dimensions of reality that were unseen, very much real and very much in our best interest to be in accord with, that can impress themselves upon the world and manifest themselves. And so the frag events become cinematically and in our daily life sacramentally, those places where there's a suggestion of more than can be measured. It's something supernatural that is inimical to human flourishing, and then through the revelation of the gospel, that is very much conducive to it.
One of the things that I really enjoyed about the book and the way you're framing the kind of theological exegesis of horror as a genre is you see horror films, you describe them as underground places where the transcendent's been displaced and distorted. And so I wonder if you can elaborate on the idea of God being banished, another one of the lines you use, and how horror films, especially the supernatural ones, often inadvertently have a host of presuppositions around a worldview, right? Like we talked about it being a conservative genre of horror films. Part of it is it presupposes a metaphysical worldview that, is ultimately shattered and problematized in different places.
Yeah, I mean, when we think about, and I will admit, the summer was not great for my movie watching. I did get to see Sinners at the end of the spring, and then 28 years later, but I'm behind, woefully behind, in fact. Mine is just it's an anecdotal observation that if when we start to look at the top 10 or so horror films, they almost are they slide certainly toward the supernatural. And so what was interesting is loads of students, I remember, I have so distinctly kids saying to me in class, big lecture class, "Oh, hey father, I'm an atheist. I really don't buy into God and everything, but I'm really into like angels and demons." And I just, in my ever so humble and pastoral response, I'm like, bro, you have one F metaphysics. That is impossible. You cannot have that. No, I forbid. He said, you can't have angels and demons, and you can't have, that's just silly Billy Gumdrop stuff. You can't do it. And the students, they find most of my outrageous comments entertaining. But there is something to be said that these kids they'll shell out the money to go watch a horror film, the Conjuring series, multi-billion-dollar franchise. These films that have that you would see no religious value in them on one level, but then you scratch beneath the surface and they're raising deep theological questions. And in order for the movie to work, they have to be compelling enough that the metaphysical, theological framework of a world where there is a supernatural realm, where there are demons that can plausibly infest, invade, possess a home or a host, that this is possible. And so the students, I think, are attracted to this. They are by mystery and the unknown. And so I figured, right then and there, they're not finding God necessarily in the church on a Sunday morning, but they are interested in the questions that are adjacent to questions of God. And, at the end of the semester, I talked to the kids about all the different superstitions that they come from, what their grandparents have and what they have preserved in their own practices. But there's a way in which they think that their behavior maps onto a cognitive framework that they hold. And so that's why I think horror it can be a fun place to get them to do the work of theological reflection in a way that takes flesh, their own, before as they watch someone else's flesh get ripped or ravaged, taken from them.
Well, you mentioned even having that conversation about superstitions and such, and I had this experience. I've taught graduate school way more than undergrad, but undergrad, when I was teaching theology and pop culture class, and the talking about much more metaphysical questions comes up, it was amazing how, because the reference points are film, they volunteer experiences that would never have been volunteered if you were teaching a theology and culture class in a seminary. And I had a student talk about, it reminds me, when I was 7, I swore there was a ghost that lived in my room, and I talked to it. And then another, these are students, would say they're none, or they might be spiritual but not religious. And why do they want the demons and angels? Because they've had experiences they need a explanatory reference point for, right? And because so much of the origin of the conversation wasn't Jesus casting out a demon or something like this. It was it was like these transcendent ruptures in a film that they volunteer their own narratives. And I wonder, what's your experience been like that as someone who has a caller reminding them of your larger metaphysical commitment and orientation, but that muting, I don't think it's just because you're at the university invites us to mute chunks of our experience and act like they don't count. And film, in this format, I think invites everyone to give testimony to the time, right? Like the depths opened up, or you have your frag event or whatever.
That's what I find helpful is to have it becomes a objective artifact that we can, I don't want to say triangulate off of, but it gives us enough distance between me as teacher, the students, and then this thing that we're talking about. But that creates, in the distance, its externality, it creates room enough for each of us to share as one is comfortable. And so students will, you start talking about the Blair Witch Project. Great. We talk about erotic narration, about asking questions that get answered to propel the plot along. Well, that's the dynamic of human life. We ask questions, we learn what we don't know, we keep asking questions, and we keep expanding our repertoire of knowledge. Well, what happens is because they're comfortable talking about that thing, they will take the risk of disclosing from themselves experiences and ideas. And that, for me, is where the money is, because then you're seeing them take a risk. This is not a horror movie per se, but I do reference it in the book. Martin Scorsese's first short film is called Viet 67, or The Big Shave. And you can find it if you do a bit of a Google search. It shows this good-looking young guy going into a very sanitary, clean bathroom, shaving, and then shaving cuts, and this basically self-immolating behavior as he's cutting, and there's blood everywhere. And it's gory, it's gruesome, but I wouldn't say now it's horror. But I gave a talk last month in July to Sam Sorich's Theology of Horror class at John Paul the Great University out in San Diego. And it hit me at that time we watched the movie with the students, many of whom film students who had not seen it before. And I said, all right, look, The Big Shave, called in parentheses Viet 67. If you were to rename this movie today, if you shot this film instead of Viet 67, what would you call it? And they got all excited. It was on, things about anxiety and drug addiction, poverty, and the economy. But it all came out of, they saw this artifact, this external thing, and then said, oh wait, this is resonating with me. And I can talk about it in a way that is not so self-implicating that I'm totally exposed, but I can at least control enough of what I hang out there. And it led to I could have done the whole 3-hour class on that video alone, that 5-minute clip. You could have spent 3 hours and given each one of them time to talk about it, to interpret it, and it would have been fun and revelatory. And so, yeah, I think film is music, another art, any of these can be loci for really deep conversation if you give them the prompting and the invitations to share.
Yeah. In the book, you talk about the dark transcendent in horror films, where it kind of generates terror and this kind of thing. And I wonder how that concept serves, or maybe you could unpack, because you talk about how it serves a photographic negative of the divine transcendent, the dark transcendent does. So what does that reveal about the world beneath or deprived of grace? It's like the grace element for you that photographic negative kind of hinges on. So dark transcendent to the divine transcendent, how do you see that at play in horror?
Yeah, years ago, I used to compare, or I would say that the difference between Night of the Living Dead, Romero's film, and Flannery O'Connor was not the violence. It wasn't the level of violence, the intensity of violence. It was presence of grace. That in the Night of the Living Dead, you watch a film basically bereft of grace, of hope, taking place in Muerto County, Texas. Literally, in the opening scene of Texas Chainsaw, not Texas Chainsaw, I would apply this to as well. I'm going to say take Texas Chainsaw in Muerto County, Texas, and it opens literally at the place of the skull in a cemetery with these desecrated coffins. But with Flannery O'Connor, you do get a moment of grace. You get a moment of the transcendent breaking through in a way that transforms, even if only for a fleeting moment, the consciousness and the nature of the person. And this, A Good Man is Hard to Find, or Ruby Turpin in Revelation. And so what I'm interested in, the dark transcendent as a category has both natural, so the shark in Jaws, killer bees, worms in the movie Squirm, probably Saw. Yeah, I would say, you could look at Saw. That film series raises its own questions. Texas Chainsaw Massacre, certainly. Michael Myers originally. That these are natural, dark transcendent avatars of a hostile force that seeks to destroy or silence the status quo of characters. And then there's the supernatural dark transcendent. And those, obviously, I think horror, Pennywise the Clown, The Conjuring, Insidious, maybe Sinners would count. You could probably get some pay out of that. Tarot, The Ouija Board, Phantasm, all of these films, Nightmare on Elm Street, where you have hints and intimations of another reality that does not have humanity's best interest at heart, that is not redemptive or healing or salvific, but is ravaging and harrowing and sordid, always attempting to undo the goodness of creation. And so that's the negative. And part of it is it plays off of some of our deepest intuitions, like the goodness of creation, the possibility of redemption, that the frailty of the flesh is, while it is our human condition, that there is something beyond what it, beyond meta, beyond ourselves, that this other, capital O other, that breaks into the world in a horror film and that horrifies and terrifies in, say, the Gospels, where we look at Jesus, who in a way breaks into sin's status quo, does so in a way that shows another way of life is possible. So it's not a theory of dark and light transcendent, but it is really the practice of this is what the world is like. Dark transcendent, this world is like a place where the demonic can break in to destroy. The world of the revealed by the gospel and the good news, our world is one that is porous and open to the healing and saving hand of the Creator who casts his lot among us. So it gets, again, the ability to play with two different logics, logoi, one a logic of destruction and annihilation, one of consecration and creation. So that's what I try to play with. And I always say, like, if I could rewrite the book, it would be very different and maybe very much clearer. But I was trying to do mission work in a timeline.
Well, you talk about lovers of the genre horror as secret metaphysicians and use like what is happening, like the experience of a horror film that taps into this inherent desire to know and theologically that being made for mystery. Like, was that always just like transparent to you, or is that something you discovered and put together as you engaged films you loved theologically with students who also knew them? Like, when did you start to make the connection between the secret metaphysical wonderings of people that love horror films?
I wish I had something deep and inspiring to say about this, but I think it's more that I'm ornery. And it was when people would say, "Oh, what do I like to watch? What kind of movies do I like to watch?" And I say horror. It's like, you can't like horror movies. Like, they're silly. They're a waste of time. They're anti-Christian. As a priest, I shouldn't be watching these things. I know my students like them, and I knew that many of my students did go to church and had faith lives. So I thought, well, it can't be completely, off the grid for them to be doing this. Anecdotally, like, I had in December of 2023, the book cleared for publication. Things were moving along nicely. And it was a Thursday. And I only know it was a Thursday because in the morning I received an email that from a very concerned parent who was outraged, simply outraged. Marquette University would have a course called the Theology of Horror. And this priest, I think she probably would have met it, this so-called priest shouldn't be teaching it. He's basically training the next generation of murderers, killers, and how horrible this is. And they should be taught, I don't know what. Well, that afternoon I was elected department chair. So I had the great joy of responding to her as my own boss to tell her what I thought. And then incidentally, Saturday, one of our alums, Noah Smith, now SJ, professed vows in the Society of Jesus, having had just taken the Theology of Horror course. So I have not yet produced an axe murderer or a school shooter, but I have produced a Jesuit, or at least contributed to the production thereof. So my track record is better than that. So that's why. I mean, but I saw that they were interested, and if they had an interest in the topic, and I could get them to ask questions, and I could get them to think through the theological implications, then it seemed completely on the table to work this area.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things I really appreciated about the book are some of the turns of phrases that are in there sound like someone who has facilitated conversations with people that didn't know they've actually thought about deep questions before, right? Like so that you there's like the naming of, you love horror. Oh, you're a metaphysician. And then you help them see what's going on, and that generates conversations. And then you had this one line that feeling horror is a sign of soul. And I wonder if you could explain how our capacity to feel horror is distinct to human beings. It's tied to linguistic animals, but it reveals something, or at least the way you wrestle with it, about our metaphysical vulnerability. Something that requires like knowing that you're going to die, and that matters, right? Like for that the feeling of horror to be there.
Yeah. Horror, I mean, on one level, it's a protracted memento mori. Like, you're going to die. All of us are going to die. I mean, I use that line, like, if you don't cover your essay, ESSE, the gift of existence, if you don't cover your essay, you're going to end up in the abattoir of the film, because that's the conceit. People kill pretty spectacular ways. I just watched Final Destination Bloodlines while I was washing the floors at my sister's house, and very creative ways of killing people. But when we start to think about our capacity to feel horror, and so this discussion comes up in my chapter on the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, where it is interesting, isn't it, that there's a scene when they pick up a hitchhiker who's deranged and a member of the murderous family that will take many of the young teenagers' lives. And they pick him up, he cuts his hand, and as they boot him out of the van, he leaves what would be like a mark. He smears blood on the side of the van. Later, the teenagers discover this, and they enter into a conversation about, what does it mean? And to be honest, there's really no significance of it. I mean, is it just a smear of blood? Is it a sign that can be interpreted? And isn't that fascinating? That we live in a world where things can mean something. That material realities have immaterial meaning that can be interpreted, that can be engaged, that we don't live in a binary subject-object stimulus response, like B.F. Skinner kind of portrayed the human, but that our use of language gives us worlds that can be expanded. For instance, in that same scene with the hitchhiker, they use the phrase, "Oh, he's like a Dracula." Well, what does that mean? At that stage of the movie, we think Dracula, vampire, sleeps in the coffin, and turns into a bat sometimes. And then as the film progresses, our understanding of the truth of what it could mean to be a Dracula is being expanded by watching the Sawyer family eat their cannibal tendencies. But that's a sign of being not just having living a living creature, an anima, having a soul, anima, but being the type of linguistic creature that we are, where our that just even for your listeners right now, you're listening to over half an hour of two people talking. Those are perturbations of the air around us that you are interpreting, and you are indexing against your own viewing history, your own interests, your own thoughts about the matter, saying, oh, this is stupid, or oh, this is very interesting, or oh, I've never thought of it quite like that. But that's a sign of being a linguistic soul, that you can take these momentary, measurable pitches in tone and tenor and timbre and find meaning in them. I think, and that's, I am endlessly fascinated by that. We live in a world of shared meaning, but that meaning can't just be read off. It has to be dialogued and individually explored. And that's part of to be a soul, to be a human, to be a living creature, is to be in relation with all others, and to explore that relationality and the meaning of the relationality together.
One of the things I found really helpful or compelling about that, right, is that one of the unique challenges of our modern context, and kind of increasingly so the generation, is the way in which we have been dislodged from communal narratives. And so there's that kind of narrative detethering generates a burden on the individual. And one response that is like, what do you do when the weight of the question of being is yours and yours alone, right? Like, it's your task is to flatten the world. Let's create a world that we can manage and control. Let's make it digit. Like, the neoliberal logic is one example.
Yeah.
A reductive scientism is another example. If you're going to be religious, be a fundamentalist with a creed that's authoritative and absolute, and you're faithful by repeating it. Like, there are lots of ways we try to control the uncontrollable because we're not nested in a web of relations that, it generate the kind of porosity of being that you talk about in the book. And I think there is a different response to that in this book that comes from engaging it with a metaphysical confidence, right? Like, it requires the only theologians that would do this are ones that assume there's something about the structure of finitude that is, you exist as addressed by ultimacy.
Mm.
And that address shows up anytime you attend to your place in the world. And what you want to know, one of the places it shows up, when the narratives of control that you can escape to, it's when they're broken. And they don't break more violently and with more revelation than in horror, right? And so that breaking, but it assumes a thick account of existence,
Mm-hmm.
which is different than, say, the theology of culture in kind of like more radical theology context, or ones where it's all, or like, say, you're doing it in a Deleuzian sense on the immanent plane, or we could go through all these variations, and I wonder if that picture of a thick background for our thin and fragile narratives, I wonder if you could kind of unpack that a bit, because we talked about it when we talked about the first time you were on the podcast for spiritual practices in a secular age, Desmond, Taylor, and such. How has like a confidence and awareness, or the facilitation of people's encounter with a thicker world, changed, how you interpret, I don't know, I mean, really, like, the structure of existence, or Rahner would call it the existential, transcendental, existential, or what was the line, in his, when he's modifying Heidegger, existential, transcendental, or whatever, but like that, our finitude is a question of the infinite.
It is. I mean, and the fact that we not only do we, I think, individually all wrestle with this question, but we wrestle with the question with language we have inherited with questions we have heard posed by others. And that forgetfulness that we are not the originators of these questions or the language with which we ask them, having that brought back to the forefront of our minds is important, because we're raising questions out of a culture and out of a context, out of a milieu, or to use Desmond's language, out of a metaxute between, that calls us to account, to give an account. But it's that, again, giving that account to others. So we're always with others, Heideggerian mit sein, but we are also giving an account metaphysically about the very origin of existence itself. It is the case. When you were talking, I thought, we live in this like a culture, milieu, with what Desmond calls the objectification of being and the subjectification of value. Being is the Heidegger's Bestand. It's just a standing reserve that I can make use of as necessary. The subjectification of value, well, that's what it means with that lovely, dreaded, for me, in my experience. Well, if I could do a sequel to this book, and this is my way of answering or getting into this, I would love to call it, it would never pass the editorial board. I would call it, There Are No Moral Relativists in a Horror Movie. Doesn't exist. Doesn't bloody exist. You can stand in front. I had 80 students in theology of 4 last fall. And you know what? If I said, these are some of them, deep moral relativism. Well, that's true for that person. And this is true in this culture. And I said, so if Leatherface comes running after me with a chainsaw, do I say, wow, he's just living his truth, he's got to be his best self? No, I say, take her, because I can outrun that before you get to me. There's no moral. I mean, we do have a sense of the perseverance of, literally, conatus, ascending, of the good, trying to cling to life. But in horror does that really well. It picks situations that provoke our own imaginations. How would I live in this case? Look at the film I Am Legend with Will Smith, based on Matheson's novel. You have someone who repeatedly, I can save us. On the refrigerator during one of the scenes, I think it says, like, is he our savior or is he our messiah? This person who's going to cure cancer and respond to the collapse of civilization brought about by human engineered viruses. It sounds somewhat familiar. And what we see with Will Smith's character is, you could probably, I know you've read Heart from Rosa, you could probably map onto Will Smith's character as well as many characters in more fully developed horror films. That's that point of resonance, that you have characters who fall deeply out of resonance. Are they able to be effective? Are they affected? Are they able to be moved? As they move out, are they changed at some adaptive moment? Do they find resonance with the world? I think in some horror movies, that's what they're trying to find, like a restorative resonance with what is other to the self, by doing away with or annihilating the obstacle to seamless, normal operation of the world as we know it. But horror, I think horror imaginatively foregrounds all the things that can get in the way of how do we live our lives? What is really meaningful and valuable? And it does so. I mean, I've gone to see one horror movie by myself. And it was only, I happened to have the time, and I was in a city where there was a movie theater across the street. I walked over and there was one thing at the time playing. So I did that. Otherwise, when I go to a horror movie, I want to go with people. I want to be in communion with others, having a similar experience. That's why we watch the movies in class. I want them to have that shared experience, undergo something. Desmond, passion, the passion of watching, of being scared together, and then the passion of unpacking it together in a way that does let us talk about our vulnerabilities, our frailties, our fears. Iris Murdoch, it always pays to ask the philosopher, what are you afraid of? Asking the students, what are you afraid of? Is so illuminating, but it's terrifying. Like, they have to expose part of their heart that they're not accustomed to doing so. but it shows like how deeply interwoven into the fabric of the world we actually are. So there's something salutary about doing it.
Yeah. Yeah. I wonder if you could say a bit about the concept of of the porosity of being and how that relates to the idea of, and this is one of the lines I underlined in the book, God dwelling in many guises, even amid the horror, or the gore of horror.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty sure that the gore of horror are places where I'm either closed my eyes or decided to stop the film. And so I'm missing out on this porosity of being.
Yeah.
I'm a wuss. Very vivid dreaming.
So I read earlier this summer John Macquarie's Principles of Christian Theology, and
Oh, yeah.
lovely book, lovely. I would love to teach it. It's long but good, and he looks the way he phrases creation as God's letting be. But whether how much you want to put that towards like the Eckhart's Gelassenheit, but that letting be, let God let it creatively, letting be what is other to the self, have its own integrity as a self. What that in my Desmondian slip shows certainly here, Desmond does not see creation, nor does Thomas Aquinas, or I think any theistic thinker, as a one-off event of God created, full stop, and then walked away as it operates. Here we have a notion of creatio continua, that God holds all of creation in existence, endowing it with esse. It is because God wills it to be. All that is gift. We're all undergoing that passio, the passion of being, passio ascende, undergoing being at all moments. But the porosity here is that it's not just that I am undergoing creation, but that you are undergoing creation, that the squirrel on the tree outside my office, that children and animals and stars and quarks and muons and gluons, all that is sustained in its existence by God, so that there is a porosity between all finite beings and the infinite origin of all being. And that porosity extends to what allows for us to be in communion with one another. What, again, for Rosa, allows us to be affected by the world around us, that we're porous and vulnerable. And that porosity is not something to be shirked away from. I mean, yes, it can be exploited, but it is also what allows us to find communion and resonance and relationship with each other. And so in horror, yes, there are some pretty graphic ruptures and breakdowns and convulsions and contusions. But if you start to scratch beneath the surface and reflect on the meaning of that, you start to find something of divine gratuity in the sometimes gratuitous violence. And I don't like gratuitous violence. I don't like seeing things go into people's eyes or the eardrums getting ripped out of their head. I find that off-putting. But I do find interesting the way that in horror, it can amalgamate a community, galvanize action, that this is something we're in together. And I think horror, sometimes it shows us at our best morally, like we have to pull together to face this foe. It also shows us as foolish. Like, no, we will separate and go our own ways. And no, I will take on this avatar of evil on my terms. And usually that just ends up. But that porosity, the fragility of the flesh, the fragility of infinity, also points toward and is the opening toward the infinite. So it's not just the infinite in theory, but it's an infinite that's a transcendent that touches our very flesh vis-a-vis the cinematic world that the film creates. But I think porosity is what makes prayer possible.
Okay, you're mentioning Macquarie there. It's been a while since I read that, but he says something about, right, like in letting creation be this, where he plays with this dynamic of where creation is to be properly attuned, and it has this dynamic to it of both connected to the divine but distinct from it. In each one, like when you or when you're overly connected, that leads to idolatry, right? Like the confusion of the finite with the infinite, the self with the divine. But then when you're too distinct, it leads to alienation. But that alienation, which, he's reading as someone very familiar with Heidegger and the existentialist movement, that alienation from the divine first shows up as an alienation of the self, because the self is the one that images the divine, and that's why you were let be. and so that dynamic there, I think, is really connected to that concept of the porousness of being, and how the inversion of that God world dynamic that explodes in horror kind of calls us back to account. And you kind of wonder, right, like horror would play a different function in an age that confused itself with the divine than one that exists as alienated from, in which tends to be the more late modern experience, right? Where, like, I mean, even like in Paul Tillich in his Theology of Culture talks about how the primary anxiety of the age orients the questions of significance, and that sense of the secular age that you talked about in the previous book, where like part of that is the way in which our distinction has turned into an alienation. It echoes in like the ongoing conversation about the meaning, the crisis of meaning, that is increasingly present in younger millennials and to Gen Z and stuff that are showing up in our classrooms.
Well, I mean, so much of this is when porosity, rightly appreciated, it's a non-disabling dependence. It's non-disabling. It's an empowering dependence. I know who I am because from whence I come. I know the gifts I have are not of my own creation, but they have been given to me to share with others. And that the more rooted I am in the creative, originative source of existence, the more me I am. So it's the bogey God, the false idolatrous God, that, the greater that God is, the less I have to be because I'm in competition with it. I think in that letting be, the glory of God is the divine generosity that plays out not in 10,000 places with Jordan Manley Hopkins, but in infinite number of places and spaces, that each finite reality discloses a little bit of something of the infinite plenitude and generosity of the divine architect. And I think that certainly would change depending on the cultural emphasis of the age. But in ours, live your truth, autonomy, authenticity. I think there's an evangelical edge could well be to start to reclaim the sense of a non-disabling dependence, that your authentic self is not to be apart from, one word, apart, but to be a part of the cosmic symphony that is creation. I mean, it's our alienation from one another, and I think ultimately from our divine source, that is so horrifying to me about many of our students and the anxiety of our age, because we're built for communion. And so the undoing of that is finding ourselves as a part of something, a bigger story and a bigger cosmos.
One of the movies I actually got all the way through was The Purge.
Yeah.
And when you're talking about The Purge, you're looking at mimetic desire, scapegoating, and in that section, you said that the logos at the heart of creation is an expression of the Creator's desire that we live together as community. And then you look at a host of different films, but something like The Purge involving mimetic desire and scapegoating to expose the deformation of this original divine design. So, not assuming people have read enough Girard to immediately locate the theory. Can you kind of use The Purge and kind of play out what's going on in that engagement?
Sure. I think I could do this fairly quickly too. René Girard's insight, one of his primary insights, is into this nature and structure of human desire. We typically believe that we desire in a linear fashion. I have my iPhone, I have my book bag, I've got my suit luggage, because I'm a coolly rational, detached knower. and I have a calculus of information that I work through. Well, Girard says, well, that's simply not true, that he sees our desire as mediated to us. And so the line that gets used is, I desire according to the desire of others. When I teach this, the best Monday of the school year for me is the day after the Super Bowl, because I'm looking at what were the most effective commercials shown. Because what do commercials do? They show us what we should want and why we should want whatever it is. So Michelob Ultra used Willem Dafoe and Catherine O'Hara to market their beer. Bud Light, trying to recoup from a disastrous public relations campaign 2 years back, uses Post Malone to sell its beer, to show not just what we should want, but the type of life, the way of life that we should aspire to. And that, for Girard, gets encapsulated in a very pithy phrase: all desire is a desire for being. All desire is oriented to a way of life. And in the movie Purge, we see that. The film opens with the new founding fathers who have instituted a kind of like a bit of a martial law. One night a year, you're able to purge or vent your rage in a no-holds-barred act of violence against your neighbors. Those who are wealthy are able to buy home security systems to protect themselves from their neighbors. Everyone else, it's all bets are off. And they tout this. Oh, crime is down, homelessness is down, poverty is down. Well, of course, because it's the unhoused and the poor that are getting killed. And we know this, but fine. The Sandin family is the main characters of the movie, and the Sandins have grown prosperous economically because they sell the security systems used to protect families on Purge night. And in their subdivision, there is, what becomes obvious, resentment and animosity toward the Sandin family because they have built a new addition on their house on the backs of other people buying these home security systems from Mr. Sandin. And so the Sandin family is enriched at the expense of others. This creates rivalry between the neighbors. And as you watch, you have mimetic violence that gets vented onto a scapegoat, an African American, apparently a former military who's being hunted by a group of white teenagers, clearly are affluent, and the intra-neighborhood conflict between neighbors and the Sandin family, who will ultimately try to scapegoat through violence and death the Sandin family. And that gets subverted because the Sandin family, who helps to rescue the African-American man, he in turn rescues the family and allows Purge night to play itself out in peace, and a new year to begin. But it's that film is, and I think the second film in the series do a really good job at unpacking and making very concrete some of the dynamisms that Girard talks about: the nature of mimetic desire, the nature of scapegoating, the exposing of scapegoating, the revelation that another way is possible beyond a way of violence, and maintaining the social order on violence. I think that's all in that. It's not a great movie, but it's a fun movie to watch with Girardian eyes.
Yeah, that's helpful. Okay, so you draw a contrast between superstitious practices and sacramental actions, and you talk about them both as eccentric practices, but the way their eccentricity differs is important. And in that section, you talk about the film Hellraiser. And so, what is that? Kind of using that film, what does that say about the nature of divine grace and human will? That contrast between superstitious practices and sacramental actions.
Yeah, so when I think superstition / magic, really, it is trying to arrogate to the finite human individual the role of control over forces external. And we know, like some superstitions, I always wear these socks on game day. I always have a banana split before I get on a plane. There's certain things that people do because it gives them a sense of power and control over the world around them. And that, I think, is a temptation, superstitious practice, that we think that we can somehow cajole or manipulate the divine to do our bidding. And I think anyone who has ever really prayed for something or for someone knows that doesn't happen. So the contrast to that is sacramental. And so if superstition, the origin, is the self trying to impose control over what is other to the self, the vector of movement is different. Sacraments are divinely initiated acts, events, brag events, if you wish, great of God being manifested in history in particular ways, revealing always what God is trying to do. So in the Eucharist to feed, in baptism to wash, in anointing to heal, in marriage to bind together, in reconciliation to bind up, and healing wounds. That those sacramental practices they call us out of ourselves and into the world as God desires and dreams it to be, especially as revealed through parables, through Jesus's healing ministry, the ministry of the church at its best. So the distinction is one, I think, kind of the dark transcendent and superstition, the divine transcendent and the sacraments. It's ultimately who is the initiator of the action. Does it come from me? My will be done, which might be great for me, but it really is the living hell for everybody else. Or is it thy will be done? Allow me to serve. So it's entering into two different logics. One is imposition of my logic on all that is. The other is allowing the divine logos, the divine logic, to manifest itself in and through my service to it.
Yeah. Okay. So here's the last topic that I definitely wanted to talk about. I'm sitting here like trying to pick between my list from the notes. I will just say to everyone, there are like a host of different fragments that get played out. So like the book, you've heard a whole lot about the framework of the book, but it's hard to like go through all the different films and we can't spend as much time to tell them. But like it's quite a bit of fun, and it's got me to, since reading it, watch movies my son requested to watch with me that I've wussed out on in a previous life. But in your discussion of the Black Phone, which I have not watched, but in it you use the Black Phone to talk about eucatastrophe. And you say that how, as a place to discuss how God works providentially through all things to redeem and renew a world shattered through the frag event of sin. Now, I know we excursed this on Tolkien last time you were here, which I love it quite inappropriately. Like if I was going to get to add something to canon, which I know Protestants say things like this, Catholics. This is not speaking for Ryan. I would love Lord of the Rings and canon. It has dragons. We don't have Bell and the Dragon in our canon, so if we're going to get a dragon, let's have Smaug. Let's just have the Legendarium in there. But I wonder if you could introduce that concept of eucatastrophe and such, and then, say enough about Black Phone to illustrate what you're doing with it, because you give little shout-outs to Lord of the Ring characters and the On Fairy Stories essay by Tolkien, which I mean, if you haven't read it, then what are you waiting for?
Yeah.
Go read it. But
especially the end of that essay. I mean, that's where, Tolkien just shines as a thinker, I think. So when we think of like a eucatastrophe, we are, I'm going to quote from Tolkien on this. A good work of fantasy, Tolkien writes, should bring us to tears and produces its peculiar effect because it is a sudden glimpse of truth. Your whole nature chained in material cause and effect, the chain of death, feels a sudden relief, as if a major limb out of joint had suddenly snapped back. It perceives, if the story has literary truth, on the second plane, for which see the essay, that this is indeed how things really do work in the great world, for which our nature is made. For Tolkien, there are events, and so like Frodo in Mount Doom, where it would seem all is lost. Frodo is not going to commend the ring back into the fires from whence it was forged, and thereby betray his vocation as a ring bearer. And you have Smeagol, who appears, and in the film especially, a good example of this, bites off Frodo's finger and then falls into the flames, and the ring is returned. The eucatastrophe is a good catastrophe. It's something terrible has happened, and something good yet something good happens because of it. And I think many of us can find, if you reflectively consider moments of eucatastrophe in our lives, the job not gotten that was soul crushing and terrifying, that turned out to be the opening for something bigger, better. And you said to yourself, oh, I think I felt God's hand moving in this. Not that God didn't want me to have the job, but that I feel that I was being accompanied, that God was my companion in this process. And so when I look at the film, The Black Phone, when I screen it, only thing I say to the kids before we watch it is, I need you to say, God writes straight with crooked lines. We watch the movie, and then I have them. What did I tell you before the movie? God writes straight with crooked lines. And then you see their eyes light up like, oh, because you could take that film and say, what a bleak, supernatural type of film. But if you think through the way God can work through providence, through other causes, you start to see that, well, without minimizing the tragedy of the loss of life of others who have come before, you can see how each one put into place one element or segment that allows that the abduction of Finn, the boy, is a eucatastrophe that does turn out for the good, because it's a breakdown that allows a divine, supernatural breakthrough that restores the balance that threatened by the film. And so you becoming sensitized to and having the ability to discern eucatastrophes, I think is a spiritually helpful practice. Certainly it's illuminating for the movie, it's illuminating for literature, but even in our own spiritual lives, to learn that skill of being able to figure out, like, oh, yeah, that was a difficult period of time. That does not deny the pain, but what it does do, what we can identify eucatastrophes, is it rescues us from what I see as the great threat to good theological thinking, our obsession with trauma right now, which itself is traumatic. But everyone obsessed about their trauma. But there has to be redemption beyond trauma. There has to be reconciliation beyond trauma. Otherwise, we get into these trauma ghettos, and all we do is talk about trauma to each other. And that I would rather not do. I would rather just drink beer with you than talk about trauma all the time. And I think a eucatastrophe is a rescue from that incessant doom spiral of trauma talk.
Yeah, I noticed the way in which you develop or playing with the concept of eucatastrophe there connects to some of the invitations of sorts that you do towards the end of the book, where you talk about this kind of invitation of how Christ empowers us to be fragments of God's grace in the world. And maybe say just a bit about that, of kind of the horror as a genre, and then thinking about, as you kind of like think through it and tracking the metaphysical significance of what's being discussed, and the kind of honesty and transparency the genre can even bring to the fore of our simultaneous brokenness and openness to the transcendent, that the horror genre then kind of gives us a narrative outline or orientation for thinking about the life in our world, right? One which is the assumed conservative reality that of the beginning of every horror film that then gets disrupted. And anyway, I just thought it was such a great way of like framing how what happens in the book also helps us think about our own story and the story of those we live with.
No, thank you for that. If you recall that line earlier, Robin Wood, normality is threatened by the monster. And in a way, the positioning of the text is to say, in the most helpful, holy, hallowing way, the incarnation of Jesus Christ, the birth of the Logos, is itself a monstrous, horrific event, because that the birth of Christ disrupts the status quo of sin's hold on the world. And when we look at how Jesus was greeted, now those of us who are Christians, we say, like, you are the Christ, Son of the living God. But if Jesus is who he says he is, it reveals a great deal about the ways we have fallen short of the world that he came to inaugurate, the kingdom of God, revealed in his ministry, in his teaching, in his parables, that disclose the way the world could be. And if we have ourselves been, or if that parable, that fragment, a little fragment of a parable, breaks into us and creates that frag event of this is who I am as a Christian and this is how I'm called to live, that's not something we just, to use another saying, like to hide under the bushel basket, but we have to let that shine out. And that becomes the call, not just a private conversion, also to the evangelization of the world. This is the truth that I have encountered that has rescued me from the horror story of sin's history and its grasp upon us, and has called us into the ministry and the mission of the church. So there's something really empowering about that, that in a world broken by sin, Jesus and his ministry is received as a horror story because it threatens the status quo. But it's a horror story that reveals the horror story we have made, that sin has made of our world. And when you look at the great inversions that where Jesus is involved, where outsiders become insiders, where the lame are allowed to walk, the blind see, the deaf hear, the poor are foregrounded, the last are made, first. It's a real disruption. Jesus is horrifying. That's the line of the misfit in Flannery O'Connor's A Good Man is Hard to Find. Jesus throwing everything off balance. And if that's the new balance, if that's who we are supposed to be, where do we stand in? Do we allow ourselves to be implicated by that story and run the risk? You can't be a friend of Jesus and an enemy of the cross. It's going to happen. But do you live according to that revealed narrative, or do we just persist in the story that has oppressed so many for so long?
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I really enjoyed getting to talk to you again, and really, really enjoyed the book. Even when I haven't seen more finished films, there's plenty of narrative bits, so I didn't feel left out. So for readers, if you are even more wary of horror films, not being super familiar with them has not ruined the enjoyment of the text. When you teach the class, what's the likelihood that students are going to ask you if you've done an exorcism or something before?
100%. They will certainly ask the question. I have never done an official exorcism, but I mean, there's an exorcism ritual in baptisms. So, in blessings of houses. And so there's, but no, I'll be honest, like, I'm a little skittish and I'm very skeptical of like the celebrity priests on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube. Just, I know is Eli Roth has the Exorcist, like the Justice League of clergy who comes out and does battle with the demonic. If I could write a book right now, I have a colleague, Father Cahill Doherty. I think the two of us would like to call it The Devil's Advocates, and go in And if there are real exorcists, invite us in and let us see what you do and let us make an evaluation. But like some of these guys, I just think it's a bunch of hooey. Oh, this 80-year-old woman climbed a wall and then threw a bookshelf across. It was levitating. You know what, bro? Take a picture. You show me that video, and all our problems about disaffiliation from religious traditions are going to be solved right quick. Because we're going right back to church. If it's not a deep, we're going to be good. So a lot of this stuff, the sensational exorcisms of demon possession. I mean, that's the least of my worries. My biggest is the demonic possession of people who are utterly indifferent to the plight of anyone beyond themselves or their 401k. I think that's much more satanic and sinister.
Yeah, I mean, earlier when you were talking about Desmond and the way in which he talks about our age having an objectification of being and a subjectification of value, and the way in which horror films problematize, right, the pure subjectification of value, like I mean, that's something I've noticed just recently in the response of the different political parties to the seeming moral blindness of their own tribe, right? Like those that are Republicans going like, so now we don't care about the Epstein files, or people that were Democrats going like, how many people have to starve for you not to obfuscate? And in both of them, what's sitting there is this sense of like this collective of, in the institutions, we can't all know everything, but we're trying to trust the right people to make the right decision. And I'm just telling you, people in my own party, for whichever one it is, if you can't figure this thing out, then why should I trust you in the institutions and groups and people that selected you to choose the good when I'm not around, right? And so much of the kind of like simultaneous breakdown of conversation, be it around the impact of like starving children in Palestine or sex abuse of children in the whole Epstein thing, as this it had one of those moments, right, where that subjectification of value, everyone for their own tribe can do it. Yeah, well, that's not how democracy. It's not technically one day, but the House of Representatives calls the entire year one day so they don't have to follow the Constitution on tariffs. But that's just getting the job done. But this, you ran on it, like this kind of thing. And you're sitting there and so many people I know who are Christians, and they're like, I'm more aggressive, but like you gotta, like, why did it take 2 years for Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama to say something that kids might be starving? What is your problem? And then now we're trolling a guy that won in New York, and we're making the mayor of New York primarily related to his relationship to Israel. You start going through it and you're like, I don't know why y'all are doing this, but I don't trust you. And so like, I think that's one of those things that happens when you watch a good horror movie. Like everyone in the room will go, I all of a sudden do know there is a line of the good, and that's not it. Right. And you'll have people that resonate with any different worldview, perspective, political outlook, but they'll be like, nah, that's off limits. And in both of those, it's like the good. And
yes,
the first reveal where that kind of like tear of normality is an event where you don't know enough about a narrative to have anything but instantaneous sympathy for the victim. And if you don't, then we're really concerned about you,
I mean, just your point, I don't know if you've ever read William Lynch. He was a 20th century Jesuit, extraordinarily learned classicist, really by training. But he wrote a book, he wrote many books, but one of them was called Images of Hope. And he wrote it after being through the Meininger Clinic for his own terrible, terrible ordeal with depression. But he introduces a line that I love, a concept. He calls it the absolutizing instinct. And you've taught, any listener who has taught, you have a class of 30 kids, 30 students, 29 pretty good, if not awesome, evaluations. And then you get the one. And what's the one we obsess over? The negative one. And we make that the absolute horizon of our sense of worth, our sense of value. The absolutizing instinct is operative in every case of idolatry. This is so good, I shall make this my God. That's it. Money is so good, I shall make you my God. Sex, my body. Well, I think because we have been fed a very thin gruel of metaphysics, a thin gruel of value, that our instinct, that absolutizing instinct, is not a religious one. I think it's just a human one. And we're seeing it manifested in the politics, where the political party must become the totalizing narrative. And and I cannot question it, because to question any aspect of it is to betray my loyalty to it, and I will be punished or excommunicated. So effectively, we've done something remarkable. I think Nietzsche would be proud, wouldn't he? Like, we took the infinite and we sponged it away, and we put it into these finite political platforms with planks. And now we dare not speak against it, because we show weakness to the other side, and we betray our loyalty to our side. So we have to hold our nose and sell our souls. And I think I don't know. I always say I'm politically homeless, because I'm so displeased and disaffected with how the central tenets of who we are called to be as humans are broken, and we've lost a sense of the common good. And it's disappointing.
Yeah. Well, this has been quite enjoyable, and I absolutely love getting to connect with you, and we'll look forward to the next time. And you mentioned that you have another new book that's about to come out or something like that?
I do. During the pandemic, my colleague Connor Kelly here at Marquette and we were teaching a large lecture model team taught course. So we were the team, and from that course, and the pandemic hit, and so we started to write out our lectures to be able to share with our students. They became popular with other instructors, and we have just published, it's now out from Georgetown University Press, called Who Will You Become? An Ignatian Introduction to Catholic Theology. And what makes it Ignatian is not simply that we just talk about St. Ignatius, but we look at the way Ignatius taught people to undertake the process of discernment. And so we use theology. We introduce theology and theological concepts and theological reflection as a way of introducing students to raising and attempting to answer life's big questions, like, who am I? What do I believe? Who am I called to become? How do I understand that this is my sense of calling? And our hope is that we wrote the book we do not assume a lick of knowledge of Christianity. So there's a lot of hand holding, but lots of stories, and we try to make it relevant to the questions that our young people ask today. But we hope it helps them in their developments.
Excellent. Well, I'll have to link to that too on the post. So
I would love that.
Thank you for the heads up.
It's a good intro text. I mean, it really is. And we have secondary readings and syllabi that we are more than happy to share with people. If you're looking for a good introductory college text, or a senior, or even like a parish group, to the extent that it's helpful, we would love to make use of it.